Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to be speaking on this topic, which is a precursor to how can Norway get involved. I have a final slide on that. But before that, I'm just going to present a report that we published last week on this, and also the program we have in the World Bank Group to support our client countries in taking forward offshore wind and accelerating the deployment of that. So firstly, I'm in SMAP on the World Bank side. So SMAP is a trust fund. It's actually, we receive funding from Norway amongst many other countries. And our main work on wind up until recently on the SMAP side has been the Global Wind Atlas, which is a free website that you can visit that will tell you wind potential anywhere in the world. We actually just launched a major update to that last week, and it now goes 200 kilometers offshore. The web address is globalwindatlas.info, so that's my promo there. We also work very closely on this initiative with the IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. And IFC actually has a very strong pedigree on onshore wind, of course, no offshore wind yet, but a lot of capital invested in onshore wind, and very, very keen to now look at how they can get involved in offshore wind, along with the World Bank side, which is on the public sector financing. So that's who we are. Why this slide essentially shows why we became interested in offshore wind in the World Bank Group. Actually, 2 years ago now, so quite a long time ago, we were invited to an event in the Netherlands, and we were starting to see what was happening in Europe in terms of installations and the interest that was generating. And so we started to ask ourselves, is this something that is actually now relevant for our client countries, developing countries, and should we be starting to look into this? So, and the answer to that was yes, but why? I'll take you through some kind of key pointers. So firstly, this is obviously the key one, and this came out in the morning session in terms of cost. Countries are really not going to take this seriously unless it is a cost-effective solution that's comparable or competitive with coal and gas. And really that's now the case. If you look at some of the recent auction results, the UK just a few weeks ago, we're now in the 5 cents a kilowatt hour territory. And that, in fact, the UK result, the UK figures include transmission. So incredibly attractive prices, been driven by what's happened in Europe over the last 10, 15 years. And that's now culminating in prices that really are cost competitive with coal. So that's the first reason. The second reason, this is actually a slide from the Global Wind Atlas, is that the resource is actually very close to demand centers. And as you can see, many, many countries have a really excellent offshore wind resource. So the resource that's interesting is anything that's orange and above. And you can see that south and north, very few countries don't have any offshore wind resource at all. So, and often because cities on the coast, the offshore wind is very close to where that demand center is. And then the third reason is that offshore wind is increasingly deployable wherever, almost anywhere. This is a picture of the Hywind project in Scotland. This is actually a floating turbine that's being towed to its location with a barge, so that's not got a fixed foundation below it. And as you'll see from the next slides, floating wind, we feel, is going to be really critical to helping certain countries exploit wind power, particularly in the longer term. So it's obviously not surprising that offshore wind is now moving to new markets, US, Japan, Taiwan. Obviously, China is going to be one of the largest markets going forward. But the other in there is actually still very, very small. And so we are asking ourselves, how can we accelerate that? How can we speed that up? And obviously, therefore, help these countries to reduce their emissions? And the key question there is, are these markets, the other countries, do they risk missing the boat? And is that because they don't have the technical potential? What else is it? So we actually did a study that we published last week looking at the technical potential. And just to give you an idea, we're looking at anything above 7 meters per second. And we're looking at, in terms of water depth, anything under 50 meters for fixed and anything up to 1,000 meters for floating. And we also had a buffer zone I think it was either 1 or 2 kilometers away from the coast. So that's the criteria. Everything else is in. So if it's under 1,000 meters, it's in. If it's above, and it has to be above 7 meters per second. So we actually looked at 8 markets, 8 key markets, and we just added up the potential in those places. Here you see the fixed is the lines, and the floating is the dots. And so we picked out some of the key resources. The real figures to look at are here, fixed and floating. So India, quite significant. Philippines, a lot of floating in the Philippines. A really excellent resource, actually, in many, many places across the Philippines. Sri Lanka, we also looked at, quite significant for that country. And then Vietnam, we heard a lot about Vietnam already, and we're going to hear some more about Vietnam, but really excellent resource there, both in terms of fixed and floating. And as you can see, it's near the 2 demand centers. And then 4 other countries. All of them have very excellent resource. Brazil is off the charts. And also South Africa, very interesting because actually to really go large on South Africa, it needs to go for floating. So add that all up, and we have 3 terawatts. That's 3,000 gigawatts of potential just in 8 countries that we looked at. So that's a really stunning number. I mean, just to put that in perspective, Vietnam's installed capacity right now is around 30 gigawatts. So 400 or so gigawatts of potential. This is technical potential, but still is obviously 10 times more than they have installed, more than 10 times. So just to give you a quick summary on what we're doing, we launched this initiative in March. It's being done by SMAP in partnership with IFC. We have around $5 million right now, and we're looking at 3 areas initially. One is knowledge generation, dissemination, etc. This is very standard for us, but in particular trying to bring the knowledge from Europe and other markets to our client countries and also adapt that knowledge so that it's relevant to them. We're going to look at we'll be commissioning country studies where we have a request from those governments, and then we will be helping those countries do the downstream technical studies that they'll need to actually develop projects. So on the knowledge exchange, this is the report that we published last week. If you want to look it up, that's the title. You'll find it on the World Bank website. We're also looking to do 2 further reports in the next year or so, in particular a big one on the key factors for deployment in developing countries. This is a picture from the study tour. We had a seminar and study tour in the UK. We actually went to the northeast of England. That's a jack-up vessel, just to give you a kind of an idea of the size of some of the infrastructure we're talking about. We brought 24 representatives from 11 countries, and we're looking to do a similar event in 2020, although right now we don't have a location for that, but we would like to focus very much on floating wind for that. And out of that event in the UK, we actually now have interest from these countries in actual engagement in projects in those countries. So we've been talking to all of these. We actually visited Vietnam 3 weeks ago. My colleagues were in Turkey last week, and they're in Sri Lanka and India this week. And then we'll be doing events in South Africa and Brazil in early 2020. So we're moving quite quickly. The demand is very, very high, and we hope to help these countries then carry out roadmaps and then do the technical studies that they need to do. So just to give you an idea about the kind of what this costs, both in particular, this is more looking at the public sector side, but what these governments will need to actually do this work, bearing in mind they're starting from 0 in many cases. And if you look at what developed countries have in terms of capacity, take the Netherlands, they say they have a 20-person full-time team working on this, just doing these preparing these auctions, etc. So most of these countries will have to build that capacity. We would start with these upstream studies. That might be around $1 million, hopefully a bit less. But then the downstream studies is where it really gets expensive. Now, some of that can be done by the private sector. Some will need to be done by the public sector, and it will depend on the country. But we'll need to fund that mainly through grant funding. And then transaction advisory to prepare the bids. And then when you actually get to project development, it would be interesting to hear what some of the developers say here. But potentially, we feel that there may be a role for climate finance to bring down the cost of those first initial projects through blended finance to make the project financing a little cheaper. So that's per country. But if we get that in place, we believe it should be possible to secure commitments from around 5 of the countries we're talking to for 20 gigawatts by 2022. That's a policy commitment, but that's the target we're aiming for. It could be a lot larger than that, but we're trying to set something realistic. So that's my final slide. Opportunities for Norway. I was asked to cover this briefly. I think the main thing to say is everybody, whether you're public sector, private sector, this really needs political backing and attention at the highest levels. So talking about this, bringing it up, and talking to governments about this opportunity is really critical. Then for the government side, looking at technical assistance, obviously the kind of work that we're doing, hosting of events, study tours where you have experience to share, innovation funding for floating wind, and then climate finance. Of course, Norway is a contributor to most of these areas. On the private sector side, there's going to be a lot of consulting and advisory opportunities, technical studies that will need to be carried out, where, again, your oil and gas industry may have a lot of experience in doing that kind of study in the marine environment. Project development and financing, so again, having big companies that can actually take these projects forward. And then the manufacturing and the supply chain, and bringing some of that expertise and setting up facilities in these countries. These countries are really looking for the economic development and the jobs as well as the power. So having a positive story to tell on the supply chain is going to be really critical to driving their interest. That's it from me. Those are my contact details, also my colleague in IFC. Thanks very much, and look forward to the questions.